بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم وصل عليه. سبوح قدوس رب الملائكة والروح. Friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. In today's video, I want to discuss a controversial topic, which is the intersection between theology and socioeconomic political issues. And on my channel, I discuss both types of topics. And I discuss, largely I discuss theology, but I also discuss socio-political and economic issues. And today's topic is a sort of a mixture between the two. And the very word liberation theology, it has the word theology within it. So it is a theological subject by its very title. And before we discuss this topic of liberation theology and my views on it, let's define it and let's go by the standard definition. The definition is, according to the Oxford Dictionary, quote, a movement in Christian theology developed mainly by Latin American Roman Catholics that emphasizes liberation from social, political, and economic oppression as an anticipation of ultimate salvation, end quote. So this is a topic which, at least based on the definition, is more relevant to Christianity, but that's only because the term was coined by Christian theologians in Latin America, but it is also relevant to the Muslims and to the world of Islam, as we're going to see in this video. But before we get to that point, I want to mention the fact that the context of the development of liberation theology is, at least the modern liberation theology, it is Latin America. And Latin America during the 1970s and during the 1980s, in particular, Central America, Mesoamerica, and some other countries, was the site of a lot of conflict and leftist sort of rebellions and insurrection, some of them successful, some of them not so much. And in particular, if you've ever heard of the El Salvador Civil War, the Salvadorian Civil War, then it was very relevant there. And the situation in Mesoamerica was that there was a racial divide between people who are more of European descent and those who are more indigenous Amerindian, where the Amerindian and indigenous people, they tended to be dispossessed economically. They were the peasantry, whereas the people of European descent, they tended to dominate the countries, dominate the economy, dominate the government, dominate the politics, dominate the military and the security forces. And so the campesinos or the indigenous people or the peasantry, they would often uprise against the system, against the European domination, though the struggle was not explicitly, defined by racial terms, but there was definitely a racial component to it. There was definitely an economic component to it. It was the peasantry against the landlords, or against the aristocracy, the landed elite, and against powerful capitalists and industrialists. And this is a story that you'll find throughout the world, but particularly in that period of time, the 1970s, and 1980s, when these civil wars were going on in the United States of America, especially during the Reagan administration, was very much supportive of the so-called reactionary regimes that were putting down the leftist revolutionary forces. And because Latin America is very heavily Roman Catholic, and at least in that time was very religious, that there was a need to kind of marry the religious part of it to the social economic issues, to come up with a comprehensive ideology to combat the system. And this is where liberation theology comes in. And a lot of the liberation theologians, they appealed to the fact that Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels, he's portrayed as somebody who was very concerned about the poor, the dispossessed, the Sermon on the Mount, and his keeping company with people that were considered outcast by the rest of mainstream Jewish society. So they took those themes from the ministry of Jesus and from the Gospels, and they created a foundation for liberation theology within the church, within the Christian church. So that's the historical context of it. Now, as I already defined, liberation theology, it's concerned with liberating the people from economic, social, and political oppression, and that this is a means of salvation. And this is the problem with liberation theology, that salvation is a purely spiritual concept. And it has nothing to do, at least from our Islamic perspective, salvation has nothing to do with being saved from poverty in this world, being saved from political and social oppression and suppression or repression in this world. Salvation is salvation in the afterlife. That this in this world we secure our afterlife. We secure our salvation in the afterlife. That is salvation. So this is a major problem with liberation theology, is the materialist undertones of this theology, where material prosperity or material deliverance from people's material problems, from their poverty, from their economic condition, from their bad political and social condition, that this is considered salvation. But this is not salvation from, certainly not from the Islamic perspective, and definitely not from the Orthodox Christian perspective either. And this is why officially the Roman Catholic Church actually denounces liberation theology. But some of their priests and theologians have attempted to sort of strike a compromise position. And this is something you'll see with a Roman Catholic archbishop named Oscar Romero. They made a movie about this individual as well. And this was an individual who was a Roman Catholic, mainstream Roman Catholic theologian and archbishop of in El Salvador. And he initially he was not favorable toward this liberation theology, but due to the severe repression in El Salvador that he witnessed, that he found himself compelled to speak out on these issues, which he did, and it got him assassinated by probably reactionaries within the El Salvador regime. And so now he's been canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not sure if he's a saint yet or not, whatever their process is, but the Roman Catholic Church celebrates him. So the Roman Catholic Church, particularly under the current Pope, is trying to sort of, reconfigure its relationship to liberation theology. Now let's go to the other point, which is the violence that has been associated with liberation theology, particularly in Latin America. That although it is true that the reactionary regimes, the so-called reactionary regimes that were pro-Western or backed by the United States government, that they also engaged in acts of violence, but it cannot be denied that the leftists, the rebels, the so-called revolutionaries, and also those who were advocating for liberation theology, they were also violent. And that's why it was a civil war situation in places like El Salvador and other places in Latin America. So this is something to keep in mind. And also the fact that liberation theology, it is a sort of a way for people who are religious, who want to reconcile with the communists, with the Marxists, or with the Leninists and the revolutionaries, who are ideologically, who are opposed to religion. But they are trying to create this sort of liberation theology as a bridge between religion and Marxism and communism, which is a dangerous thing, because Marxism and communism, it is a very dangerous ideology, which is extremely anti-religion. And if you study their ideology, they are pushing for a situation in which religion becomes irrelevant in the world. And this is an ideology that religions have to combat and have to intellectually assault and resist. So that's another point about liberation theology, another problematic part. Now let's come to the Islamic context. Is there an Islamic version of liberation theology? I argue that early Shiism was a sort of a liberation theology. And similarly, the early Kharijite movement. that they're focused on some socio-economic issues, and they're uprising against the Muslim governments and Muslim regimes at the time in the name of spreading the wealth, and in the name of the peasantry, and this sort of thing, in the name of those who are considered to be oppressed or suppressed or outcast. That this was a sort of an expression of liberation theology in the early days of Islam. And it only became sort of crystallized as an ideology as these sects developed. And in modern times, you had Ali Shariati, and I made a video of him previously, who wrote the text called Red Shiism, where he makes a distinction between Red Shiism and Black Shiism. And he basically describes Red Shiism as a revolutionary religious movement that wants to, save the peasants or uplift their social economic condition by launching a revolution against the system, against the capitalist system, or against the aristocracy, or against the whatever system is in power, and create a sort of a socialist utopia, which is what he calls Red Shiism. So Red Shiism is definitely an example of liberation theology. Likewise, you could say the Muslim Brotherhood, they, in their ideology, there are aspects of liberation theology. And a lot of the so-called political Islamic groups or Islamist groups, they are definitely an expression of liberation theology, not to the extent of the official liberation theology in the Christian context, but certainly it is tending toward that tendency, which needs to be exposed. And finally, I want to give you the Islamic answer, or the Islamic perspective on these questions. So, as I mentioned in the first place, salvation must be defined in our religion as the salvation of the soul in the afterlife. Securing a position for your soul in the afterlife in heaven. That's salvation. Salvation is not being delivered from the worldly problems of today, from the economic crises or the social discrimination or the political repression. That's not salvation. That's not our concept of salvation, at the very least. But however, what does Islam say about the social, economic, and political problems of the world? Definitely, Muslims should be charitable. Definitely, Muslims should look after the poor. Definitely, Muslims should strive to reform the world and strive to implement justice. But justice has to be based on Islamic principles, not on the socialist ideology of land reforms and nationalization and forced redistribution of wealth beyond what Islam has mandated in the form of zakat, for example. So Islam does not want a socialist state. And many people who talk about, an Islamic welfare state, there's no such concept of as an Islamic so-called welfare state, because Islam is fundamentally, it does not like the idea of taxation. It considers taxation to be repression. But all these socialist ideologues and movements, their solution to the economic problems of the world is to tax the rich and enrich the poor thereby. It is to force people to distribute their land equitably, and it is to other means that Islam would consider theft. Islam would consider that to be theft. You can't force somebody who has a lot of land to actually give up that land and redistribute it among the poor. Yes, Islam would require a person who has land to pay a tax on that land called ushur. The 10% of the agricultural yield has to be given as a form of zakat, which we call ushur, meaning the 1/10 or 10%. But you can't take a landlord's land, no matter how big that land is, and force him to give parts of that land to other people without his consent. That would be considered theft. And so this is a fundamental Islamic teaching. And likewise, you can't nationalize industries that are private. You can't take over somebody's private business, somebody's factory, or somebody's business, and nationalize that. That's totally un-Islamic. That's theft, and that's a human rights violation. Even if you want to go beyond religious understanding, this is a violation of human rights, basic human. Everybody has the human right to protect their property. Islam considers a person's blood, property, and honor to be inviolable, to be sacred. Property is sacred. Property is sacred. No government on the face of the earth has a right to violate a person's private property. Islam guarantees the protection of private property. Islam guarantees the protection of this fundamental human right. And this is something which I suspect is incompatible with those who promote liberation theology, whether in the Islamic context or in the Christian context. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.